First of all, we are so recalled of the era almost 50 years ago when John Kennedy campaigned for the presidency. We have once again a candidate who is sort of a handsome candidate with great personal magnetism that calls to a younger generation to call forth their idealism and brings forth the possibility of renewal in American politics. And every so many generations there's this great need for renewal. So that's why the link is being made between Obama and Kennedy. Whether or not Obama wins, that's the link that is there. And there's also some other similarities. They're both authors. And there's some differences too. John Kennedy, at least at the time he ran for election, was much more of a hawk in foreign policy, much more militaristic than Obama is coming across as being. There is some similarities with Obama and John McCain in that they're both war heroes and they both highly value courage and have written books. Kennedy wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Profiles in Courage, which exemplifies what it is to have courage and stand up against the current of what people are thinking and for the greater good of the country at personal sacrifice. And certainly that's a big part of John McCain's story in his campaign for the presidency. And I think we're so reminded this summer when Obama came to Berlin. We're taken back to that day 45 years ago when John Kennedy spoke to the world in Berlin. And what he says about Berliners could very much have been said to the people of Warsaw, who've had so many partitions and invasions, and whose sense of freedom and integrity has so often been compromised or damaged. So I want to play a clip from the speech in Berlin.
Oh, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was, Civis Romanus sum. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are some who say, in Europe and elsewhere, we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin. And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
He also said, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. It was an extraordinary day, and John Kennedy considered that to be one of the most amazing days of his entire life. I think he said afterwards to his aides, how can we ever beat this? 5/6 of the population of Berlin was in the streets that day to hear him speak. And across the wall, there were the East Germans who listened from across the wall, and they were not allowed to clap because the guards were watching them, but they listened to the speech. So when Obama came to Berlin, he called up our memories of this time when an American president stood for symbolic unity and support for the entire world. They were all one people. and we all need to work together. And we'll come back to that idea. I want to say a little bit about John Kennedy's background, and that comes from the book that I just wrote. This is the picture of the Kennedy family in London. And John Kennedy's international upbringing during the years 1938 to 1940 formed the basis for his ideas, his philosophy, and his way of presenting himself during the presidency, which then carries forth to this day in terms of his legacy. When his father, Joe, who felt very much like a Catholic outsider, not accepted in the establishment of Washington, his father worked very hard to get Roosevelt to appoint him as the first Irish Catholic appointed to the very Protestant court of St. James as ambassador. And Joe and Rose Kennedy, Jack's parents, thought this was the entree into acceptance and finally being accepted as people and not just looked upon as Irish Catholics looked down upon. And at that time, this period of 3 years is extraordinary in Jack Kennedy's life because in 1938, when his father was appointed, he was what we call a slacker sophomore at Harvard, which meant that he was much more interested in chasing the girls than he was in studying. And his brother Joe, Jr., who was 2 years older, was a very good student, so he felt almost like he couldn't compete. And there's just one story I want to tell about them at that time to show what they were like. His brother Joe had gotten a date with the actress Katharine Hepburn, and Jack was very jealous. So he was going to a nightclub one night where he knew Joe would be, and he found this other actress named Gertrude Nielsen, who was just coming out with the movie Top of the Town, and she was starting her great successful career. So he brought her to the disco to show up his brother that he too could get a date with a famous actress. Well, his brother was waiting. He went to the phone and he arranged for someone to call Jack to the telephone for an urgent message, and while Jack was at the phone for the fake message, Joe ran off with Gertrude and spent the rest of the weekend with her. So this shows the kind of brotherly competition, and that's what kind of thing he was doing in 1938 at the beginning. But then in June 1938, he came to London, and Joe Kennedy wanted both of his sons, Joe Jr. and Jack, to serve as his assistant at the embassy, which is in the tradition of John Quincy Adams, who served as his father's assistant when John Adams was minister there, and Charles Francis Adams. So you could see Joe Kennedy had great ambitions even at that time. And Kathleen Kennedy, the second oldest sister, took the London season by storm, and she became immediately friends with the heart of the British aristocracy, and the famous Cavendishes and Salisburys, who were the great political aristocratic families of London. And by the time Jack arrived in July 1938, she introduced him immediately to the top figures, and these were people who all loved discussing honor, pragmatism, the role of toughness in foreign affairs. And Jack was in his element. He absolutely loved being in England. He loved people who discussed politics as a way of life. And so he really learned from that experience. And David Ormsby Gore, who would later become Britain's ambassador to the United States under Jack Kennedy, who became his good friend in London, among others. And so he also then became his father's eyes and ears in 1939 when both Joe Jr. and Jack were sent to Europe as war was about to come on in the spring of '39. And they traveled to Poland and Russia and Germany and France, and they became the eyes and ears, reporting back from the embassies, going out and talking to the people of the street to tell their father what was happening. And as the last days before the war came on, Jack actually filmed the last days in Berlin before war came on. He bought a movie camera. Joe went to Poland, and they were absolutely fascinated with the degree of the Nazi propaganda that made it seem like the Poles were causing the Nazis to want to invade them. They completely turned it around, saying that there were atrocities by the Poles against the Nazis, and that's why the Nazis had to invade. And they were absolutely amazed at the extraordinary effect of propaganda. Both Joe Jr. and Jack almost lost their lives that year. Jack was traveling with David Ormsby Gore in a car with British license plates in Munich, and they